didn't cause this. You didn't vote for it. You didn't sign anything. But you are paying for it because that is precisely how this system processes loss. The gains are private, the damage is public, and the distance between those two facts is where your rent increases lives. There is a platform used in nearly every major city on Earth, promoted as a revolution in community and belonging, branded with soft fonts and warm photography of spare bedrooms and smiling hosts. It told you it was democratizing travel. It told you it was empowering ordinary people. And while it said those things, it was converting the buildings around you, the ones where your neighbors used to live, into an unregulated hotel network with no occupancy limits, no safety inspections, and no obligation to the city that made it possible. You aren't looking at a mistake. You are looking at a blueprint. This is how Airbnb dismantled housing affordability while wearing the mask of a community platform. Apartment buildings in Barcelona with no permanent residents. Entire floors in Manhattan where no lease has been signed in years. Landlords in Sydney pulling units off the long-term market in the middle of a housing crisis. Neighborhoods in New Orleans where every third door has a lockbox and no one knows their neighbors' names. Rents were climbing. Vacancies were falling. Cities were building new housing stock and watching it vanish into three-night bookings. Governments published housing strategies while a private platform quietly removed thousands of units from the supply they were trying to expand. Tourism boards celebrated visitor spending. Housing departments reported tightening supply. Both trends were driven by the same mechanism, and almost no one in an official capacity connected them publicly, because doing so would require admitting that a tech company had been allowed to restructure a city's housing market without a single planning review, which is a polite way of saying the hotel industry was deregulated by an app, and renters absorbed the bill. The official story is well-rehearsed and emotionally appealing. Airbnb empowers ordinary people to become micro-entrepreneurs by sharing their homes. A teacher rents a spare room while traveling for the summer. A retiree supplements a thin pension with weekend guests. The tagline captures it cleanly: "We belong anywhere." It is a narrative built on relatability, and it works because there is just enough truth in it to feel real. Some hosts genuinely are sharing a spare room. Some do use the income to stay in homes they might otherwise lose. That fraction of the platform's activity is real, and dismissing it would be dishonest. But using that fraction to represent the whole is something else entirely. It is a marketing shield designed to absorb regulatory pressure. It allows a corporation valued at tens of billions of dollars to present itself as a neighbor with a guest room rather than what the data consistently revealed it to be: a commercial lodging operation wearing residential clothing. It works as a story. It fails as math. This is where explanation becomes performance. Because the numbers Airbnb cited about its typical host were accurate in the way that a casino's average payout is accurate, technically defensible, functionally misleading, and designed to keep you participating. The architecture of extraction was not hidden. It simply went unexamined for years because the incentives all pointed in the same direction. On October 16, 2014, New York Attorney General Eric Schneiderman released a report that should have detonated the entire home-sharing narrative. It found that 72% of Airbnb's private short-term rental listings in New York City violated state multiple dwelling law or local zoning regulations. 72%, not a fringe issue, not a gray area. The vast majority of the platform's core business in its largest domestic market was operating outside the legal framework that governed every hotel, bed and breakfast, and rooming house in the state. The same report contained a line that deserved far more attention than it received. Commercial users accounted for 6% of the hosts, but accounted for 37% of all revenue. 6% of operators were capturing more than a third of the money flowing through the platform. The spare room teacher was real. She was also statistically irrelevant to Airbnb's revenue model. None of this required a conspiracy. A BJH Advisors study in 2016 quantified what landlords already understood intuitively. In high-demand markets, just 76 nights of Airbnb bookings generated more income than 12 months of long-term leasing. The financial incentive to convert a residential apartment into a short-term rental was not marginal. It was overwhelming. And Airbnb did not need to instruct landlords to make that conversion. The platform's fee structure did the instructing on its own. The warnings existed. The incentive to hear them didn't. And this is where the weight shifts from abstraction to impact. Risk is never destroyed. It is only transferred. The landlords captured the upside. The platform captured its commission. And what remained, the cost, the displacement, the scarcity, transferred downward. The first compromise was small and looked entirely reasonable. A homeowner listed a spare room for a few weekends. Airbnb framed this as the norm, and cities had no regulatory category for it. Existing short-term rental laws targeted hotels and motels, not individuals with a Wi-Fi router and a listing. So the activity existed in a legal vacuum, not because it was legal, but because enforcement hadn't caught up. That vacuum normalized quickly. Property managers realized they could list entire apartments and operate them as de facto hotel rooms without obtaining lodging licenses, paying commercial taxes, or meeting fire safety codes. The returns dwarfed traditional leasing, and the penalties, when they existed at all, were treated as a cost of doing business. By 2015, the normalization was measurable. On June 3 of that year, Murray Cox launched Inside Airbnb, an independent data project that scraped the platform's public listings and laid them bare. The data revealed what Airbnb's own marketing had worked to obscure: multi-listing commercial operators, hosts controlling 5, 10, 20 or more properties, dominated the platform's supply in every major city analyzed. These were not home sharers. They were unlicensed hoteliers using residential zoning as a loophole and Airbnb's brand as a shield. Cities began drafting restrictions, but Airbnb deployed aggressive lobbying campaigns, ballot measures, and legal challenges to delay or dilute them. Regulation arrived years after the conversion of housing stock had already taken hold. What collapsed wasn't the structure, it was the pretense. Freeze the frame on 2018. The New York City Comptroller's Office publishes a report with a single number that quantifies what renters had been feeling for years: $616 million. That was the estimated aggregate annual rent increase imposed on New York City tenants, not by inflation, not by construction costs, not by population growth, but specifically by the removal of housing units from the long-term rental supply by Airbnb conversions. $616 million redistributed annually from renters to operators, not a market fluctuation, a wealth transfer with a return address. The losses were real, so were the gains, just not for you. What follows isn't history, it's your cost of living, because that $616 million figure was a snapshot from a single city in a single year. The mechanism it measured did not stop at the city line, and it did not stop in 2018. The visible aftermath played out in rent figures and displacement statistics. In cities from Lisbon to Los Angeles, long-term rental supply contracted, while short-term listing volume expanded. Landlords who once offered 12-month leases began offering none. Buildings that once housed families began housing tourists. The physical infrastructure remained identical. The economic function reversed entirely. The policy response, where it materialized, arrived with predictable limitations. Cities like Amsterdam, Barcelona, and New York implemented caps on short-term rental nights, registration requirements, and platform reporting obligations. Airbnb challenged many of these in court or through political action committees. In several jurisdictions, the company spent millions on ballot initiatives to craft regulation on its own terms, writing the rules it would then be governed by. The distinction between regulated and self-regulated blurred by design, and who absorbed the cost of this transition period, the years between the platform's growth and the arrival of enforceable regulation. Renters did. Tenants in cities where housing supply was already constrained watched their options narrow and their rents climb, not because demand for housing had surged, but because supply had been quietly redirected to a more profitable use case. The apartments still existed. They were just no longer available to the people who needed to live in them. The downstream effects compounded. As rents rose, disposable income fell. As disposable income fell, savings rates declined. As savings rates declined, the financial resilience of an entire generation of urban renters eroded. People delayed homeownership not because they lacked discipline, but because the entry point kept moving, and one of the forces moving it was a platform that had converted their potential housing supply into 3-night vacation stays. The housing connection is direct and measurable. In neighborhoods with high Airbnb density, studies across multiple cities documented rent increases between 1.3 and 3.1%, attributable specifically to short-term rental activity. Those percentages sound modest until you apply them to cities where median rent already consumed 40 or 50% of median income. At that threshold, a 2% increase is not an inconvenience. It is the difference between stability and displacement. The wage connection is equally concrete. Workers in the service and hospitality sectors, many of whom could not afford the neighborhoods they cleaned and maintained for Airbnb guests, found themselves competing for housing with a platform that treated their apartment buildings as inventory. Their wages did not rise to match the rent increases the platform generated. The gap between earnings and housing costs widened, and it widened fastest in the neighborhoods closest to tourist demand. Debt filled the space that wages could not. Credit card balances expanded. Student loan repayments stretched. The normalization of financial precarity among urban renters accelerated, and the connection to short-term rental economics was rarely articulated publicly because the causal chain was long enough to obscure. But the mechanism was simple. Housing supply was removed, prices rose to reflect reduced supply, and the cost differential was financed by the tenants who remained. The psychological dimension is the one least measured and most durable. The experience of competing for housing against an algorithm, of losing an apartment not to another family, but to a commercial listing optimized for tourist revenue, reshapes how people relate to the cities they live in. It produces a specific kind of exhaustion, the sense that the place you call home is more valuable as a product than as a residence, that you are occupying space someone else could monetize more efficiently. That feeling is not irrational. It is an accurate reading of the incentive structure Airbnb created. You weren't a customer, you were the yield. Housing markets are not neutral mechanisms that balance supply and demand with mathematical fairness. They are arenas where regulatory frameworks determine who extracts value and who absorbs cost. Airbnb did not break the housing market. It exploited a gap between residential zoning law and digital platform economics, a gap that regulators were too slow, too underfunded, or too politically constrained to close in time. The platform's real product was never belonging. It was regulatory arbitrage, the ability to operate a commercial lodging business under residential rules, capturing hotel-level revenue while bearing none of the hotel-level obligations. They banked on your unfamiliarity with zoning law and platform economics. Your defense is granular, local, and specific. Track your city's short-term rental registry, monitor proposed housing legislation, and understand that every policy debate about platform innovation is also a debate about who gets to live where. The data exists. Inside, Airbnb still publishes it. Your city council still votes on it. The question is whether you are in the room when those votes happen, or whether the only people present are the ones who profit from your absence. Every housing crisis teaches the same lesson. Losses are distributed, profits are not. Now you carry this. Eventually, the timing will feel coordinated, wrapped in policy language, and you'll know who's being assigned the cost. You weren't warned, now you are.